So welcome. Thank you for joining us to the Altman Health Talks. I have the pleasure of introducing Chad Gooding, and he's going to be speaking today about help for vertigo victims. So Chad, I'll hand it over to you, and if you just want to give maybe a brief couple minutes, tell everyone about yourself, and then get started, and let me know when you'd like me to advance the slide.
Okay, well, thanks, Julie. I'd like to first thank Julie and Danielle for setting this up. This is definitely unique and different, and I'm excited to do it. Usually, I'll do a couple of these health talks a year, and this is definitely going to be different, but I'm looking forward to it. My name is Chad Gooding. I'm a physical therapist here at Altman Tusk Therapy, and this is really cool for me because I'm actually giving this talk in the room where I actually treat dizzy people. So typically that's not the case. I'm usually at Altman West or Altman North, and so it's neat to be in this room. So I'll probably move the computer around a little bit to kind of show you guys a few things, but today we're going to be talking about dizziness and vertigo. And just a little background about myself. I'm a physical therapist that I've been a therapist for about 20 years, and I've been treating dizziness for about 16. And I would say throughout the day, I probably 80% of my caseload is dizziness, and the other 20% is like orthopedic or neurological things, Parkinson's, so on and so forth. So I'm certainly excited to be here. We have a dizziness, balance, and fall prevention program. It's myself and my colleague, Andy Belts, here at Altman Tusk, where we're treating a lot of dizziness and vertigo victims. One thing before I forget, if you all, on your screen, you have a chat button. If you want to hit that and just kind of put some questions down at the end, we're going to have a lot of time for questions. So if you're like thinking of something, you could just type that in, and I'll make sure I address all of your questions at the end. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to have you go next slide. So I have just a couple statistics on why dizziness is a problem, right? So big statistics. The first is more than 90 million Americans, 42% of our populations will experience dizziness or balance problems. And that's from the National Institute of Health. The second is approximately 90% of individuals over the age of 65 have visited their physician at least once for vertigo as their primary complaint. And vertigo, I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between dizziness and vertigo, but when I do talk about that, vertigo just means the room is spinning around. There's a lot of different causes for vertigo, and certainly a lot of different causes for dizziness, but dizziness is more of lightheadedness, imbalance, funny in the head, but we're going to talk about both of those things. And when I give these statistics, I always think about, when did it go wrong for us, right? Like when we were kids, we were just talking about our daughters, Julie and I, when we were little, like 8 and 9, we used to love to get dizzy, right? You go to merry-go-round, you go around as fast as you could, you'd get on a sliding board and hit that sucker, as we got older, I know for me, when I was in high school after prom, we'd always go to Cedar Point. We'd pay a lot of money to get dizzy. And then, as we age, it becomes a little less fun. And to be frank, it becomes very dangerous. So I really look forward to exploring that with you all today. So I'll have you go to the next slide. So by a show of hands, and I can't see everyone, but that's okay. But how many people have been dizzy? I imagine it's, yep, I can see Lynette raised her hand, and I can imagine it's going to be the majority of the people listening. So the bottom line is it affects a lot of people. So we'll go to the next slide. Dizziness, in addition to being a big problem, can also be extremely confusing. The reason is there's over 70 different causes of dizziness. We treat the inner ear here at Altman Tusk, the vestibular system, and we're going to talk about that. And that's one of the 70 causes. It's easy to dismiss with medications and medicines. Now, medicines do play a role in treating dizziness, but unfortunately, there are a ton of side effects with a lot, dizziness is a big side effect with a ton of medications that can affect our treatment. So when someone comes in and they're dizzy in our clinic, every single person that comes in, I'm going to ask them 3 questions. The first question is, what do you mean by dizzy? Tell me, describe the feeling. Everyone describes their feeling of dizziness differently. Some people say lightheadedness. Some people say the room's spinning around. Some people say I'm funny in the head. Some people say I'm off balance. That's the first thing I want to know. The second thing is timing. How long does your dizziness last? Does it last seconds? Does it last minutes? Does it last hours? Or does it last days? That's really important information. And the third is we call triggers. What movement makes it worse? Or does movement not make it worse? These are three really important questions that I want to know. I'll have you go next slide. So in addition to being confusing, it is a huge problem. Look at this. Of the falls seen in the elderly last year, 50% of those falls were the result of a vestibular problem. Vestibular is just a fancy word for inner ear. So it's a huge problem. Now, when I give this talk in person, I don't know how this is going to go, but I'm going to try this. So I always tell a joke here, right? So I'm going to give you guys the joke. I'm not going to hear you laugh, but I'm going to pretend like you're roaring laughing. So whenever we talk about falling, I always think about a priest that came to a parish. Everyone in the parish loved this priest, but there was a problem. During confession, he was hearing that a lot of the people in his congregation were committing adultery. You can imagine the huge problem this is. So on Sunday, he went and he went and he said, you know, we're going to have to do something about this. This is a huge problem. Like I said, the parish loved this guy. So they had a secret meeting. And in the meeting, instead of saying they committed adultery, they were just going to say they had fallen. And it worked. 40 years went by and the priest grew old and he eventually passed away. Unfortunately, a new young priest then came in. You can imagine his concern. Everyone is falling. So he went to the town mayor. He said, we have to do something about the sidewalks in this town. Well, the town mayor is part of the parish. So he knew the inside story, the inside joke, and he started chuckling. Well, the young priest got mad and he goes, I don't know why you're laughing. Your wife fell 3 times last week. So anyways, the moral of the story is falling is bad, right? So it's terrible. It's not good. So, and it only takes one fall to put us in what we call the vicious cycle. So that's my next slide. The vicious cycle starts with dizziness. Then you can become anxious. When you get anxious, you get nauseated. If you saw the Cleveland Browns play on Sunday, you know this feeling of nausea, right? So then what happens? You're anxious and nauseous. You don't move, right? Less movement. You become more dizzy, less mobile. Then you fall. It only takes one fall before you're fearful of falling. That's just natural human nature, right? So then you don't move as much. You become less active. Then you become more dizzy. So you get into this cycle, this vicious cycle of dizziness, and we want to be able to get you out of it by fixing your dizziness. So I'll have you go next slide. It's going to put all the arrows. I forgot about that. Sorry, Julie. All the arrows come. And then we'll go to the next slide. So that's my little introduction. So here's today's agenda. Not tonight. Usually I do this at nighttime. So this is great. We're during the day. So let's do this. Let's examine the anatomy of the inner ear first. Then what I did is I highlighted 4 main causes of dizziness that I see here at Altman Tusk. I want to talk about those. And then what I'll do is I'll talk about the 4 different treatments I do for those specific causes of dizziness. So I'll have you go next slide. And what I want to talk about next is just a basic introduction to the peripheral vestibular system, right? So that's the inner ear. So I'm going to try this and we'll see how it works. I have an ear, a big ear. So let's see if I can, this is hard. So I'm going to see if you all can see this, but if I look into your ear, I can only see your outer ear, right? On the other side of your outer ear is your middle ear. The guy I'm concerned about is the guy that's behind this bone right here, and that's your inner ear. It's encapsulated by bone. So I'm going to take it out. This guy is your inner ear. Your inner ear has 2 different parts. You have a part that looks like a snail. That's called your cochlea. It helps you with your hearing. And then you have your balance part, right? So you have 3 bony semicircular canals. And in these canals, not to get too technical, but there are 2 different types of fluids in these canals. So we'll just say fluid. So whenever you look up or bend over or lay down or roll in bed, what happens is this fluid moves in these semicircular canals and it bends a hair in the bulbs at the end of these canals. I'll hold that up really close. And when that hair bends, an electrical signal is sent through this nerve to your brain, and your brain adjusts your eye movements accordingly. Okay, so the take-home message. Well, not quite the take-home message, but what you need to know is your inner ears are a team. Your right inner ear and left inner ear, they work together. They work on what we call the push-pull system. When your right inner ear pushes, your left inner ear pulls. They go the exact same speed in opposite directions to hold your eyes still. They're like a shock absorbers for your eyes. So do you know what happens when your inner ear is not working properly? Your eyes will have a movement, a characteristic movement called nystagmus, and that will be toward the strong side. And what that can look like when you're walking is something like this. I'm sorry if that made anyone sick, but if you didn't have inner ears, every time you walked, that's what you would see. You can imagine how miserable that is and how much that would affect your balance moving forward. So I'm gonna have you go next slide. So the take-home message is the right inner ear moves your eyes to the left when you move your head to the right, and the left inner ear moves your eyes to the right when you move your head to the left. And that's very important for balance. And I think just for the purpose of this talk, it's important just real briefly to talk about, as human beings, how we keep our balance. I'm gonna have you go next slide. So when we talk about balance, we have three inputs. We talked about how our inner ear is an input. Our other inputs are our eyes. We have little sensors in our eyes called rods and cones. When light hits these, impulses are sent to our brain about how we're oriented with respect to certain things. So you can see my head is above my head because your vision, you're able to use your vision. And that's real useful for your balance. That's why a lot of folks fall in the dark. They're not able to use their eyes for their balance. The third input that we have is we have little sensors in our legs. They're called muscle spindles, and they respond to stretch. So you all can see my arm is behind me. I know it's behind me because I have little sensors in my muscles that respond to stretch, that tell my brain where my arm is in space, and we have a lot of those in our legs. So folks that have neuropathy, peripheral neuropathy, they lose those sensors in their legs, so that affects their balance. So all three of these things, their input, the inputs go to our brain, go to our brain stem, the back of our brain, our cerebellum, and our brain shoots out two reflexes. One to our eyes to hold our eyes still, and the other to our legs to contract and relax certain muscles in our legs to keep us upright. And that's how we have balance. So our inner ear is a big part of that. So next slide. What we'll do is I want to talk about the four main causes of dizziness. We'll first talk about something called BPPV. That's called benign paroxysmal positional vertigo. The second is vestibular neuritis, the third cervical vertigo, and the fourth Menieres disease. Next slide. This was a study that was done from a doctor in Atlanta, Georgia. His name is Dr. Tusa, and he's a specialist. And what he found in his practice, he's a neurologist that treats dizziness, is that 32% of his people that came in had something called BPPV. Next slide. This, by far, is the most common thing we treat here at Altman Tusk. It has to do with misplaced Otoconio crystals. Some people call these crystals ear rocks. What happens is, I'm going to go back to my inner ear. Remember the three semicircular canals? If you look right underneath them, right in this area, right where my finger is, underneath them, we have millions and millions and millions of tiny little crystals in this area. They sit on a little membrane, and I have a picture of it. Let me see if I can bring this up and show you all. They sit on a little membrane right here, and they have a purpose. They help us sense acceleration. So if you're in a fast car and someone accelerates, the reason you feel that acceleration is all of millions of these microscopic crystals move on top of this membrane, and then little hairs underneath bend, and you feel it. The bottom line is those crystals, that membrane that those crystals sit on, breaks down as we get older, and those crystals, a lot of times when we're sleeping, they can fall out, and they can fall and get into the tubes of the inner ear. And when they get into the tubes of the inner ear, then that's bad, because whenever you look up or bend over or get into bed or get out of bed, the crystals move, and it sends a wrong signal to your brain. Your brain interprets that signal, thinks you're moving when you're not, and moves your eyes real funny. And when your eyes move real funny, the room spins around. And this is the number one thing that we see with people that have that come into our clinic. I'll have you go next slide. So this was typically initially called top shelf vertigo, because people would get it when they would look up to a top shelf. Back in the 50s and 60s, it was also called beauty salon syndrome. They thought that by going to a beauty salon and when your head was back, it was the position of your head going back that caused it. But what they thought, it was the chemicals. They thought it was the chemicals in the beauty salons that were causing this problem. So they would call it beauty salon syndrome. Just kind of interesting. It kind of hurt the beauty salon industry back in the 50s and 60s. But really what was happening is those crystals were moving, and that position was kind of exacerbating the symptoms. So if you look at the name of BPPV, benign, it's not life-threatening. Paroxysmal, when it comes on, usually it's just a sudden, uncontrollable attack. Positional, it occurs when the head moves in certain positions. The most common is looking up, bending over, getting into bed, getting out of bed, and the most common is rolling into bed. And then vertigo is just the sense that the room is spinning around. And that's what BPPV is. I'll have you go next slide. So when someone comes into your clinic, if you're a practitioner of this, this should be one of the first things you think about. You almost have to prove you don't have this to me when you come in. That's how many people have it. I would have to say, out of the dizzy folks that come in, 70 to 80% of the folks that come to see us that are dizzy have this. So, next slide. How do you know if you have it? Well, we kind of touched on this. You're going to have vertigo, right? Which means that the room is spinning. Typically, this spinning is going to last seconds. It's going to happen when you look up. It's going to happen when you bend over. It's going to happen when you get into bed. It's going to happen when you roll in bed. A lot of times when people first feel this, it's usually in the morning after they've been sleeping. They go to get out of bed, and then the world just spins. They get nauseous. They get anxious, of course. They don't know what's going on. They think they could be having a stroke. They don't know. It's scary. A lot of times with the nausea, you get vomiting, and then you're just miserable. You're down and out. The spinning might stop if you keep your head real still, but you just feel absolutely horrible. And this is very, very, very debilitating for somebody to have this. By far the number one thing we see. We're going to talk about a little later in the program. No, you're totally fine. You can totally go to the next slide. Thanks. A little later in the program, we're going to talk about how we fix somebody with that. So that's when we get to treatment. So the second thing we see is something called vestibular neuritis or labyrinthitis. This has to do with a little infection that sits on this nerve of the inner ear, okay? So what it is, essentially, when they look at it, it's a cold sore. So it's a herpes simplex virus that sits on this nerve, and it blocks the signal going from the inner ear to the brain. So remember we talked about the inner ear, the right and left inner ear, they're a push-pull team. When the right one pushes, the left one pulls. Well, let's just say you have a virus that attacked your right inner ear. Well, the left one is pushing at 100%, but let's just say the right one's pulling at 20% because that virus is in the way and that signal just can't get to your brain fast enough. What happens is your eyes get pulled to the strong side. So your eyes will go like that. And that, if that movement's fast enough, will initially start with spinning. And this is what's miserable, is this spinning can last days. It can last up to 72 hours. A lot of times people go to the hospital, they're hospitalized with this. They have to have medication. They'll give them anti-nausea medication so they don't get sick, steroids. And then what happens is that infection, like most of these infections, run its course. And now you're left with a weak right inner ear that we have to treat. So I'll have you next slide. This is definitely the second most common thing we see. People will say, well, you know, I got hit with this dizziness, this vertigo hit, it lasted a few days. Now they're like totally off balance. They feel a pull to one side when they walk. They feel extremely lightheaded. Changing positions is a nightmare. So, and it's because one of their equilibrium was off because one of their inner ears is not working properly or is weaker than the other. The good news is your brain doesn't like that and will adjust those signals over time. But what we do here is we speed that up, and I'm going to go over that in treatment too. I'm giving you guys all kind of cliffhangers here. So the third thing we see, cervical vertigo. Another word for this is cervicogenic dizziness. And this has to do with, remember we talked about those sensors that are in your legs that respond to stretch called muscle spindles? You have those as well in your neck. You actually have the second highest density of them in your neck. So if your neck is not moving properly, if it's tight due to disease or arthritis, or because you were dizzy because of an inner ear problem, those sensors can't tell your brain where your head is in space. And then you can have symptoms such as headaches, lightheadedness, visual symptoms, and it becomes a real problem. So this can actually be a cause of dizziness on its own, or it could be a secondary cause, meaning somebody might have, let's just say, the crystal's loose, and they know if they keep their head still, they won't get dizzy. Well, then the problem with that is their neck gets real tight, and that leaves them to feel lightheadedness, and they get caught in this kind of cycle. I'll have you go next slide. So the possible causes of this has to do with just different disc disease, osteoarthritis, irritation of the vertebra, just loss of that proprioception of your neck. But another possible cause is just avoidance, right? Because if you know you have an inner ear problem, you're just avoiding getting dizzy and you're moving as a unit and your neck is getting tight. And that can cause even further dizziness. So the last thing I want to talk about, so the next slide, is something called Menieres disease. We do not see this a lot in the clinic because a lot of times this is controlled with diet, and I'll explain. This is actually how I got involved doing this, is my dad has Menieres disease. And he struggled with this in his 40s and 50s a lot, and he would have these attacks, and it was scary. And what happens is, remember we talked about the fluid that's in the inner ear, and there's two fluids. Not to get too technical, but one of the fluids is high in sodium, the other is high in potassium. So for some people, if they have a lot of sodium in their diet, what will happen is that will cause pressure, and it will cause these fluids to mix and to swell and to push against the bones of the inner ear. And when that happens, you have an inner ear that's hyperactive, and you actually will make the room spin around. Typically, when people have this, they complain of spinning that lasts 1 to 3 hours. A lot of times they'll notice, you know, they've lost some hearing a little bit in their ear during that time. And if they go to sleep and they wake up, they feel a little better, but they're a little off balance. A lot of times this is controlled with diet, a low sodium diet, a low caffeine diet, and sometimes it's treated medically with a diuretic or a water pill. So we'll go next slide. Typically, if you have these attacks over time, over and over and over again, it will leave one of your inner ears weak. It will do damage to your inner ear. That's where we'll come in. You'll come in, you'll say you have these episodes. Now you're a little off balance. So we'll do some balance training with you, and we'll do some exercises with you to help you with that. Which leads me into the final part of the presentation, which is about treatment. So I'll have you go next slide. We do here at Altman Tusk what is called vestibular rehabilitation. It is one of the few types of therapy that can take a person's problem away in just one treatment. And when I talk about that, I'm speaking specifically of those crystals that we talked about, the BPPV, and we'll go over that. But there was a study that was done that says it can significantly improve the sensation of dizziness from 1 day to 6 weeks on average. So we'll go to the next slide. It's an essential part of fall prevention. It's extremely cost effective. You don't need any unnecessary tests such as MRIs or CT scans. Next slide. So, the question is, why do we do what we do? Well, we want to be the medication. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. So yeah, this is funny. So as a medication has any side effects, right? Don't you feel like you take a pill for everything, right? You have some type of ailment and you take a pill for it, and you're taking, and that's good. I mean, you have to. I mean, that's very important to take your medicine. But we want to be the pill the doctor prescribes for your dizziness. So we'll go to the next slide. Yeah, so this is a prime example. This would be great though, right? I mean, if you could take a pill that would like exercise, you wouldn't actually have to exercise. Look at that guy, he's exercising. And that's just fantastic. So, okay, let's go to the next slide. So, we have our dizziness, our balance, dizziness, balance and fall prevention program here at Altman Tusk. So what are our goals? Our goals, first and foremost, are to eliminate your dizziness. That alone will help prevent falls. We want to improve your fitness and thus your quality of life. So we'll go next slide. Let's just talk briefly, and we can't go real in depth with these just for time and the complexity of these certain things, but I just want to talk about we do more than just 4 treatments. These are the 4 most common treatments. So the first one we're going to talk about is something called a Cantaloupe repositioning maneuver. That's what we do with people that have crystals loose. The second treatment I want to talk about is something called adaptation viewing exercises. The third is neck treatment, and the fourth is balance training. So let's look at the first one. So we'll go next slide. So a Cantaloupe repositioning maneuver. This is for treatment for those that have BPPV or that have crystals loose. So right, if you remember, these crystals have fallen out and now they're in our canal, our back canal. So whenever we lay down in bed, the room spins around. Let's just say it's on the right side. So we roll on the right side in bed and the room spins around. It's because these crystals are moving in here. The logical question is, well, how the heck do you know that besides a history? We use infrared goggles here that we put on you. And we lay you down, and the bad part about this is we try to make you a little dizzy. And the reason we do that is we want to see what your eyes do when you're dizzy. So if crystals, let's just say, are in the back canal, when you lie down, your eyes will kind of move up and turn. And we'll watch that. Actually, I have a video. Let's try this and see if I don't know if you guys will be able to see this, but this is a video of somebody that has it. Can you see that at all?
Yeah, if you just move it up a little bit.
Okay.
There you go.
Watch their eyes when they get dizzy. Can you see them bouncing? I don't know if you can see that movement of their eyes. But,
yep.
Okay, great. So what that tells me is that movement, right? If you saw it, you probably said, oh man, the eyes are kind of going up and down. But what they were actually doing is they were going up and turning to the right. So that tells me her problem, this person's problem, was in her back right canal. Because this canal controls the eye muscles that cause your eye to do that. So we know, just based on that the crystals were loose in the back right canal. So we can do a maneuver where we use gravity and roll you around on the mat to take these crystals around, and then we sit you up and dump them back into the vestibule, and they come out of this tube. So we do the corresponding maneuver for that. And what that can do then is it gets the crystals out of the semicircular tubes And that gets rid of your dizziness. Sorry, I'm just kind of reading my screen. It's kind of interesting. Next slide. Let's see. So other question is, how effective is it? Well, it's extremely effective. I would say this is 95% effective, right? So if you come in, and a lot of times we can treat this in one visit. I would say 40% of the time, I think is the statistic, that we can treat this in one visit. 60% of the time, you have to come back for a few visits. It's extremely effective. Now, the problem is with this particular type of dizziness or vertigo, it can come back. So if you don't get it treated, the good news is if you have crystals loose, it's probably eventually going to go away. It can take up to 12 weeks to go away. You have about a 90% chance of it coming back. But if it's treated, we can get rid of it right away. We can get rid of it rather quickly within a week, sometimes within a day, and you have about a 50-50 shot of it coming back. And that's why we like to treat it. One, to get you symptom-free as quickly as possible, so you're not so much of a fall risk, but also studies show that it doesn't come back as often. All right. Number 2, adaptation exercises. This is the second treatment we do. This is important to understand. This exercise we do not do for people that have crystals loose. It would be miserable to do with people that have crystals loose, because we have you move your head like this and stare at something. And if your crystals are loose, you would get so dizzy. This treatment is for, remember we talked about the virus, a virus that attacks the nerve here and it makes this weak. This is a treatment for just a weak inner ear. What we're trying to do is we're trying to strengthen your inner ear by having you move your head and stare at a dot. What that does is that strengthens your inner ear. So that's called an adaptation viewing exercise. That's the second most common treatment we do. Next slide. So the third treatment we do, and I probably do this treatment not only for someone who has cervicogenic dizziness, but for a lot of people that have crystals loose, because their neck just gets so tight because they don't want to move their head. But it's just basic neck treatment. We try to relax the suboccipital muscles, which are these little tiny muscles that connect your neck to your head. We want to relax those, and we want to massage your neck. We want to do exercises and get your neck moving. But we want to do that when the crystals are back in place. So once we do get your crystals back in place, then we do this. And what it does is it helps prevent that lightheadedness that a tight neck can bring. And the final thing we do is just balance training. So if you have an inner ear problem, or if you have a problem, peripheral neuropathy, and you're unsteady on your feet, or God forbid you've fallen, you're fearful of falling, we want to strengthen your balance muscles. And we do that in 2 ways. We do what's called static balance training. And that's balance training where we put you on like non-compliant surfaces, foam, different things, have you stand in your bare feet with your eyes closed. Of course, you're supervised. And then we also do dynamic balance training where we have you walking. And when you're walking, we're having you move your head. We're having you move up and down. We're having you walk backwards. So we're really challenging your balance muscles. And we really want you to keep moving. So in conclusion, so we'll go next slide. Yes, we talked about why dizziness is a problem. We talked about the 4 main reasons or causes of dizziness that I see: BPPV, the crystals; vestibular neuritis, that has to do with that little infection that affects your inner ear; cervical vertigo or cervicogenic dizziness; and Menieres disease, that has to do with the fluid changes. And then we talked a little bit, just briefly, about the types of treatment that we do here at Altman-Tusk, such as the Cantaloupe repositioning maneuver, the adaptation exercise where we get your head moving to strengthen your inner ear, the neck treatments, and then of course balance exercises. So that really concludes my talk. If you find yourself with any of these symptoms, there's help. A lot of the symptoms of dizziness that specifically comes from your inner ear can be managed with physical therapy. So talk to your doctor about it. If they feel we can help, we would love to be able to help you. Our number's on the screen there. And I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to kind of open it up for questions.